Hello and welcome back to another video and another book to movie adaptation series. This is our first video in this series. We are going to be talking about Hellboy throughout this entire series. We're going to have several different videos related to this. We are going through the comics, we are going through the original movies, and we are going through the new movie that comes out on Netflix in April. So today we are starting with a reading vlog talking about the comic books. The new Hellboy movie is based off of a 3 comic book run within this series, so we are reading those 3 comic books to prep for it, and this is our thoughts on that.
We are currently not fully aware of how well these will actually tie in with the future film.
True.
This is just what the internet has told us that, oh, it's clear this is what they're adapting, and these 3 issues. So we went ahead and picked up its volumes 8,
9, and 12.
8, 9, and 12. And
so we've got Volume 8, which is Darkness Calls, Volume 9, which is The Wild Hunt.
And then The Storm and the Fury, which I think we're going to see a
12.
lot of the stuff. Like, he even has the sword from the trailer from the
Yeah.
new movie. So it'll be very interesting. I have read, like, no Hellboy comics.
Really? That surprises me.
Yeah, so I've seen, like, different panels and stuff from them, like, on the internet, but I've never actually sat down and read, like, a full Hellboy comic until now, but I've wanted to. So this is going to be fun.
So we started off with Volume 8. We are going to be doing this video, this reading vlog is going to be 3 check-ins, essentially, all in one video. So we're reading one volume at a time and then sharing our thoughts before we move on to the next one. So for today's purposes, well, today to you is all 3 of them, but for today, us filming it, is for Volume 8, Darkness Calls. So this is starting in the middle of a series, which I was really hesitant about going into it because I thought we were going to be really lost, which happened a little bit. So let's talk about our thoughts on this.
So as we went through it, I mean, before we jump into what actually happened in the book, I can just say that I didn't necessarily feel like it was that we jumped into the middle of the series as much as I felt like its style, which we will find out as we read the next 2, that I felt like there's just lots of things that just happened, and then Hellboy's like, oh, like, I feel like every time I turned a couple pages, someone else popped up and was like, this is how it is.
So I think the fact, we have seen the original 2 movies that are done by Guillermo del Toro. We love the originals, so we are familiar with this character. I think you a little bit more so than me, even though you're not super deep into the comics. So we're already familiar with Hellboy and his backstory. I think that helped going into this. I think that if you're wanting to prep for the movie and want to know the source material first, you might want to read through this whole series to get a good vibe for it, because I think starting with number 8, if you know nothing about Hellboy, you're going to be real freaking confused.
Very possible. I definitely felt like as we went through this, this volume is split into 5 chapters, and I felt like chapter 1 and 2 I was pretty lost, but then by chapter 3 I felt like I kind of hit a groove with knowing what was going on and being able to follow, despite all the pop-ups of someone new being like, this is clearly the god of this, and this is what happens, and blah, blah, blah. I felt like I was a little bit I was following better.
Okay, I will say that I think to help go into this comic, not only would it be helpful to know Hellboy's backstory, but it will also be helpful to know mythical history.
Yeah.
I don't know, isn't Roman? Is it Roman?
This is Russian.
Russian. Well, we've got
because we have Baba Yaga and we have Aleshin but Hecate's
Hecate's.
Greek.
See, that's what I thought. Okay, so there's a lot of different gods and stuff in this story that if you're not familiar with those different lore things, you're gonna be a little bit confused. I will say there are sections in this that have like little asterisks on them. Let me see if I can find an example.
That will tell you like, oh, when he calls something, there's like a house spirit in this called like a Bromsky or something like that.
That's actually like my favorite part.
Yeah, and it'll actually have an asterisk saying, oh, this is a house
so
spirit.
it'll have a little asterisk further up in the story, and then down here at the bottom, it will have a description of what's going on. I don't know if you guys can see that. But, so this specific page that I turned to, it basically is referencing a previous story in this series, a separate volume. And then there's other ones where it'll just describe, like, what the god is that just got mentioned or something. So I did find that pretty helpful. The other comics I've read in the past have not had those references, and granted, they haven't really needed it. So I thought that was a nice little addition.
Yeah, so ultimately, I mean, what happened in this novel was pretty interesting. It starts kind of confusing to me. There's a bunch of witches gathering, trying to do a thing.
They reminded me of the 3 witches that we see pop up a lot in Greek mythos, essentially.
Yeah, and I felt like it was clear they were trying to get him to be the leader.
Yeah, which is pretty on par with what I know of Hellboy previous. Yeah. That's a common theme, especially because this influences Hellboy 2, which we've seen.
And he says no and rolls out, but then he gets transported. It seems pretty random. He just gets like poof transported to another realm, which seems very Hellboy, where he's like, what? And then like, of course, Baba Yaga, who is apparently this powerful witch, rolls up, floats up on her little box, and is like, you stole my eye thousands of years ago. And I like, there was actually an asterisk that was like, it was actually just 1984.
Yeah.
Like,
it was hilarious. Or it was like 1864, I think is what it was.
Oh, something like that. Yeah. But it was just like, no, it wasn't thousands of years ago. It was just like a little bit ago.
I think one of my favorite things about this volume is the snark and sass, which is very on brand with what I know of Guillermo del Toro's interpretation of this. So I was really happy that it seems like he adapted that pretty well from the comics and stayed pretty true to form. And Ron Perlman also did that pretty well, but this is not what this video is about. But I did like a lot of the snark and sass. It's no secret I like snarky, sassy characters, so it was fun. Also, it kind of helped ground a lot of the story because I found that with all of the chaos going on, Hellboy not panicking or being really thrown off. He was just like, okay, let's deal with it, or let's do this, and oh no, someone's after me again. His chill demeanor, I found helped calm the crazy.
I felt as soon as I tried to have more of that demeanor reading this novel, it went a lot smoother for me. When I just started being like, anyone who pops up on the next page is someone brand new. Cool, let's roll with it. Let's roll with it. And as soon as I started doing that, it went a lot smoother because, like I said, every panel does have someone brand new you've never met before, never heard of. They might appear in the previous 7 volumes, but I think a lot of them may not.
Maybe not.
Yeah. And so they pop up and they just go, this is this person, this is what they do. And I think when you have Hellboy's approach of being like, okay then, I
personally find it really hard to recap the events that happened in this just because I think it just boils down to a lot of different creatures and gods coming after him, or Baba Yaga hiring people or controlling people to go after him essentially, and him just dealing with that one-on-one. And then I think as we get further into it, we'll get more into the heavy plot of it. I don't really know any better way to sum up.
I would definitely say that the way this ties into the plot of the movie, if I had to guess, is that there is this other subplot going on while Hellboy's running around this alternate dimension. Baba Yaga's hunting him. He's trying to get back to our world. And there's this side plot of these people trying to resurrect Hecate.
Yes.
And she's the queen witch and all this stuff. And
I know a little bit about her, so I wasn't quite as lost on that, but I don't know enough.
Yeah, so essentially, she almost looks like Medusa, and they put her in an Iron Maiden, but now she's metal, the Iron Maiden things herself. Pretty interesting, but I definitely think that may be the character they're adapting to be the Blood Witch or whatever it's called.
Oh, okay.
So they're open. So the way they tease that at the end of this, they open it and she's going to be freed, and that's kind of where this book ends. And I think that's going to roll into the bigger plots of the other 2 that we'll see happen, which is probably why they recommended this one to start, even though the main plot of this book I don't think will tie into the movie at all.
Maybe not. But I think my initial thoughts, just starting with this first volume, trying not to make this check-in too long, is that art style-wise, I quite like it. My only complaint about the art style is that it's very busy during action scenes, and I found it very confusing, especially when I don't understand some of the intricacies that's going on with the monsters or whatever you want to call them. I found it a bit confusing when we all of a sudden go into this huge battle scene and I'm I don't know what I'm looking at, especially because we do have a very limited color palette with this. It's all blacks, grays, and reds, and some yellow. That's essentially all of our color. So because of that, it's very dark, which I think fits the vibe well, but it's just hard to follow in some of the busier panels.
Yeah, and the very stylized line work. It's really pretty,
yes,
but it is sometimes hard to figure out what's going on because everything's so blended together and so striking and different. Yeah, it's easy to get lost. There's a couple pages where I looked at it and I was like, and then once I spent a couple seconds staring at it, I was like, oh, I see what's happening.
And maybe the busyness of the certain panels is just my personal like reading style, essentially, is because I read comics a little bit more like a book where I'm just kind of going through it. I don't really take the time to sit with panels or pages very long. And so when there's a page where I have to do that to understand what's going on, it like interrupts my reading flow, which annoys me a little bit. It takes me out of my reading experience. And I think that might just be something that I need to get used to with switching to a comic medium.
But I'm definitely interested to see what happens as we move to the next volume, if we're a little more clued in, or if, like I said, the style will continue of things just happening and you having to be like, oh, this is the new thing, this is the next new thing, as we read through these comics.
I'm also interested to see as we continue, because we've got 8, 9, and 12. Obviously, we're going to skip 10 and 11. I'm curious to see if we're going to miss out on a bunch. But at the same time, I know that some of the volumes in this series, because this is essentially like a big collection of Hellboy stories, is the gist I get from it from doing a little bit of research. And so I know some volumes are more like little anthologies, like they have little bits in them. So I'm wondering if 10 and 11 are something more like that, or they're like bottle episodes of TV shows, they're bottle episodes of comics, so we don't necessarily need them. You're more familiar with comic runs than I am, if that's like a traditional thing or not.
Yeah, I mean, from what I understand, I think his series does have a lot more, like, there are some, like, looser tie-ins, but a lot of them are just like, oh, this is a Hellboy story, this is the next Hellboy story, not necessarily a, like, linear storyline of this is all of his adventures in order leading into a much larger storyline. But that was our first check-in for this first volume. Like we said, we're going to read through the other two of them. Sorry for the lengthier one, since it's the first Hellboy Hellboy comic we've ever read. It takes a little longer to dive into it. I think the next two check-ins will be quicker, but it will be a week for us. We're going to read the second volume and talk about that one here in a second. Welcome back, everyone. It's only been a second for you guys, but it's been a few weeks for us. It's been a little longer. But we actually have been continuing to read the Hellboy series, and today, for this portion, we are talking about Volume 9. This is continuing that same story arc in the Hellboy universe that the new movie is supposed to be based off of, and so we're going to talk about it.
So I liked this one a lot better than Volume 8 that we read. I don't know if it's because we're now a little bit more into the story, where Volume 8, it somewhat felt like you were plopping into the middle of something, but not so much so that you were completely lost. This one felt much more cohesive as its own volume, while also continuing a story.
Yeah, I think with the first volume, we had said that they had that whole other side plot where that one witch was trying to kill Hellboy, which has nothing to do with this overarching, like, arc for his character, but this one spent a lot more time like getting in depth with like Hellboy's character and his relationships, and I really liked it.
Yeah, and since this is a spoiler reading vlog, we can discuss some of the things that we discovered during this. So we actually find out a lot about Hellboy's parentage, which I thought was really fascinating.
Yeah, so you actually end up meeting Morgana Le Fay, which is always a fun character. There's a little more known supernatural elements, whereas I felt like the first book had a lot of things I had never heard of. Like,
yes,
I couldn't tell if they're made up or folklore or
lore
whatever.
From like elsewhere in the world that we're not as familiar with, whereas like Merlin, Morgana, all that we're very familiar with, so a little more familiar territory.
So then you actually end up finding out that essentially he is the rightful king after King Arthur. He's the next in succession, and he's part of the bloodline worthy enough to wield Excalibur. And so you also have the main witch, evil lady, gaining power and getting stronger throughout this book.
She's fascinating to me, and I like her a lot. I think she's a good villain so far.
So clearly they're building up to a showdown, which I'm sure will come in the third volume, and he gets Excalibur, and everything's ramping up big time. And I like this one a lot, though. There's a lot of fun little details in it.
Something we mentioned in Volume 8 was, for me personally, I had trouble following some of the panels, especially during action scenes. I found this a lot easier to follow, especially with the way the panels were arranged and also the way just the art style was. I just found it a lot easier to be immersed in it instead of having to pause and really pick apart what was happening.
Yeah, so I'm not quite sure what the difference is between Volume 8 and this one, like what changed, but this one definitely did seem easier to follow. It is also a lot thicker. I think it's like almost twice as thick as Volume 8.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, and so we'll see how Volume 12 is, which is the next one that continues the story arc. Most of the Hellboy comics are actually like compendiums of short stories, so we're going to skip a couple volumes.
Yeah, because I think volume 10 and 11 are a collection of smaller stories, and then 12 will be the continuation of this arc, which I'm excited for. I'm hoping that I liked it just as much as this one. I was pretty underwhelmed by volume 8. Really, really loved this volume, so...
I will also, as a side note, say that there's a lot of fun scenes in this comic that with one of the Hellboy trailers that have come out, you can actually see several of the scenes from this comic, like, panel to like screen. It was pretty cool being able to pick those out.
I have not watched that trailer. I'm trying to avoid it. So that wraps up our thoughts on volume 9. We will be back momentarily with our thoughts on volume 12.
All right, it is time for check-in number 3. We have now finished the 3rd volume in this series, and it is actually volume number 12. I believe it is the final volume, and it is The Storm and the Fury.
Is this the final volume in the whole...
Yes, this is the closing of Hellboy's story in the comics, I do believe.
Oh, that changes my opinion about the end of this.
Yes.
Oh, hold up. I must confirm. I thought we were going to have more after this, so I was like,
No, I believe that's it. This is the grand culmination of the storylines that started in volume 1 of Hellboy.
Oh my god, you're right!
And we read 8, 9, and this is the final one, his final showdown. Everything they allude to in the Hellboy movies, this is where it leads. And I really liked it.
My opinion changes now that I know that this is the end. I do quite like this.
Aha! See?
I was a little iffy on the end, and we'll talk about why in a minute. But I still think that the second volume is my favorite out of the 3, but I still really enjoyed this one. I think my problem with, maybe not problem, but my reduced enjoyment is because I'm still not as familiar with the world of comics and how like big action scenes play out on panels, because I would say the comic books I read thus far do not have the same style as something like this, and they're not superhero comics either. So they play out a little bit differently. It was something I had to get used to, so it was something that threw me off, and I think I talked about that a little bit in the first volume check-in, but it was something that continued more with this one, but I didn't feel like that happened as much in volume 9, which was the second one in this arc.
So basically, the plot in this has some twists and turns in here. So you have the Blood Queen, and she is gearing up for a big showdown. She has these huge armies, and Hellboy is, I guess, destined to go summon the armies of the dead knights of England and go fight her. But he says screw that, leaves Excalibur in a bar in a tavern, and is like, I'm gonna do my own thing.
I do think that this comic is the most like Hellboy comic, like attitude-wise, that I've read out of these 3, because my previous experience with Hellboy is the original Guillermo del Toro movies, and I think that his attitude and this book, like from the 2 forms of media, just mesh up so well, and so it's completely in character from my perspective of him to just be like, you want me to do this thing? No. I'm
gonna do what I want, or what I feel is right. And so he leaves Excalibur and goes off on his own, and shenanigans ensue. The random guy, old man in the tavern, ends up wielding Excalibur and leading the armies.
So I was a little confused on who he was. He was like George something?
Yeah, I think part of his bloodline.
Okay.
And he was like destined. He was waiting there. He knew he was going to do it. Didn't know why. And so old man walks down and he becomes, old school, like King Arthur almost, and leads basically the armies of the dead against the Blood Queen's armies, kills all of them, which was pretty wild. And then you have a twist where the Blood Queen actually gets bamboozled.
Yeah, it was weird.
And then a character called the Dragon actually takes over the Blood Queen's body, and it is alluded that this is the same dragon that started the fall of man in the Garden of Eden.
Correct.
It alludes to that the serpent was actually the dragon.
Well, especially because one of the chapters had they always have these little pictures at the beginning of the chapters, now that you mention that, where it's like a picture of Hellboy and whatnot, and there was one where there was a snake wrapped around him, and I was like, that's weird. There we go. I don't know if you guys can see that, but got a little serpent action going on, so I thought that was interesting, and I didn't even make that connection until you just said it.
And it was definitely not what I expected. However, it was a very bold move to have the series end with Hellboy dying, essentially.
Yeah.
He crumbled into stone and got pulled into hell, and that was that.
So this is why my opinion is changing, knowing that this is the last one, because I assumed that this was going to be like a cliffhanger type ending thing, and then we were going to like have more with him in hell or whatever else. But I actually quite like this as an ending, and I feel like it fits everything that's led up to this, and I feel like it fits his attitude towards things and just his general vibe and aesthetic and what he cares about.
I definitely feel like this comic, more than probably the other two, nail the tone of, I know I'm destined to do this thing. I don't want to do this thing, but I'm the only guy who can, so I guess I will. Because that is definitely the ending where he's like, I just happen to be here, and I'm the only guy who can put this down and save the world, so I guess I will do so.
I also, speaking of the art style, I think that the ending few panels, the way that they're colored are so emotion invoking. I don't know how to explain it, but like the way they choose to do like these full panels of like gray with only the blood showing and things like that. And the closer we get to Hellboy's death, and as we get to his death and the repercussions of it, like it gets darker and darker with less color saturation, and it just like pulls you through that emotions with the colors. I really liked that.
I definitely think the color palette is probably one of the strongest aspects of these comics. I think the fact that it's just orange and reds with like blacks, grays, and reds. Yeah, you either get yellow through like red tones, or you get like black, gray, and brown.
So I'm used to reading very, very colorful comics, and so I think that the color palette of this was very hard for me to get used to, as with a lot of things in this comic book arc, clearly. But I think that by the time I got to this comic in particular, this volume, I was much more keyed in on how color was used to pull you through the story and to convey certain aspects of the story. And I really liked that. It just took me a minute to fully get into it.
Now that we've read the comics and, you know, we've seen the Guillermo del Toro movies, it definitely... I really like the tone of this series and how it just ends up being kind of a wild ride. It expects you to just take things in stride in a very similar way to how Hellboy in the story does. Things just pop up and he's like, I guess that's what we're doing now. And I feel like as you read this, the more we read, by the time I got here, everything that happened, I was like, I guess that's what's happening next. And it becomes kind of a fun, wild ride to see what kind of crazy person will pop up, what crazy mythological creature rolls in and just throws a wrench into the plans.
It's something that you definitely have to be comfortable with not knowing everything, and you have to be comfortable with things not being handed to you, and if you don't get it, you don't get it, and you're moving on. And I struggled with that quite a bit in this because I like to know what's going on, and especially because we jumped into a volume 8 of a 12-volume series. As we've mentioned before, some of these volumes are collections of shorter stories, not these big long arcs, but it's still plopping into the middle of his whole history and story. So that was just interesting. So with that is a wrap up of our reading vlog of this 3-volume arc that we read that the new movie is supposed to be based off of. We'll see how similar it is. According to the latest trailer, it will be pretty similar. I have not watched said trailer. Steven has watched said trailer.
Now that we're here and we've read the whole series, there are definitely things in the trailer. There's at least 3 or 4 scenes straight out of this one, and especially some of the scenes at the end of Storm and the Fury I recognized in this one, especially with the fight with the dragon. I think they're going to include some of that.
Oh, interesting.
For the choices of the movie, I would not be surprised if they kept it just the Blood Queen and didn't include the dragon.
Yeah.
Because it might become a little convoluted for a first movie, and I'm sure a series that they want, to turn into multiple movies. So I don't think that'll happen, but I think a lot of the setting and the tone and the world destruction, especially the London destruction, will stay the same.
Yeah, that was an intense bit of this.
Yeah.
I'm watching all of these places I've been in London get destroyed, which always makes me sad. But it tends to happen in a lot of media. But that wraps up our full spoilery thoughts on this. If for some reason you sat through this and are still interested in our spoiler-free review, that will be up soon. But let us know if you have read this comic arc or if you have read all of Hellboy's comics, what your opinions are down below. Are there other volumes in this series that you really recommend we pick up? Because I'm definitely interested in doing so. I would like to own the full series eventually.
Yeah, at this point, we're going to have to fill all the gaps.
I know.
Yeah.
So leave us all your thoughts below. Give us a thumbs up if you enjoyed this video and want to see us do more reading vlogs. Let us know if there are any book to movie adaptations coming out that you are interested in us doing a series around. It's kind of become a new thing on our channel and I quite like it. So let me know what you guys want to see, and subscribe if you like us and are interested in seeing more of this series. We do have 4 more videos coming. One is the spoiler-free review, which you guys who have watched this video may or may not be interested in. We have a review for each of the Guillermo del Toro Hellboys, and then we will have a review for the new movie. And we may or may not do a more in-depth discussion video. We'll see after we watch the movie how we feel and if we feel like doing that. But subscribe if you're excited for all that, and we will see you guys in our next video.